I do a briefing, 5 things you need to know about business processes. I've had occasions where there's been face palming, especially if I give examples from within their own organization.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process. Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers, and in each of these episodes, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with industry experts covering the topic of business process management, process excellence, process transformation, anything to do with adopting process in an organization to see real tangible value and results delivered. And today we have a very exciting episode because it is my second interview, my second conversation with the Alec Sharp, whom a lot of my audience I know is very familiar with.
Alec Sharp.
The Alec Sharp. I sat down with Alec a while ago now for a previous interview. So we get to learn a little bit about Alec, his background, his history, where he came from, where he does. But if you have recently joined us on this series, Alec has 40 years of international consulting on all areas of business process management. I know a lot of people around the world know him because he's done work all around the world. He was saying to me just before we dived into this that every other week he finds himself somewhere else in the world. So very exciting for this conversation. We're going to dive further into the work that he does. But one thing that Alec mentioned to me was in this day and age, there is a thirst for practical advice, practical techniques that you can adopt and use. And that's what we're really going to be looking at today. So Alec, thank you so much for joining me for this second interview.
Thank you, Daniel. It's great to be back. I was surprised when I looked at my calendar, and it seemed like only last week that we were having our chat, but it was a year and a half ago. So it was back in May of 2021.
Yeah,
it has been an eventful year and a half.
That's going back. And one thing I should mention is Alec's episode is one of our most popular. So we've done over 140 episodes to date. And Alec's episode is very popular, has lots of views, obviously has caused a lot of attention in the process community. So if you haven't watched that, please go back and watch that again. But Alec, I know that you work with many organizations, and in particular, very large organizations, some of the world's largest organizations, in order to adopt business process management. And I'm sure you would work with some that have a good understanding of what it is and the value it can deliver. And I'm assuming there'd be some organizations you work with that are still on that journey of understanding the full power of it. Why would you say so many senior executives struggle to understand the concept of the business process perspective? I might just use the word distraction. I certainly would not want to be a member of the senior leadership team of any, large global organization, or even not a global organization, because, especially, let's say you're a publicly traded firm. Well, you've got to worry about your reputation. You have to worry about your share price. You've got to hit those quarterly topics. Meanwhile, everybody's telling you that you've got to go to a fully remote workforce and you've got to employ AI. And there's just a lot of chatter and noise. And I think that's true, up and down the organization. As I was mentioning to you before our talk, since the pandemic, since I started doing, most of my work via Zoom, I've been the last couple of months, I've been back to Europe 3 times. And so I am traveling more, but whether it's, in-person conferences or teaching, I'm finding people just want some practical techniques. There's so much noise and confusion about, should I still be worrying about agile? Should I be, what about DevOps? What about platform engineering? And how is this helping me just do my job? So let me go a little bit further too. I don't, and this is not specifically talking about any of my companies or clients, but I honestly think I've never worked in a period where the most senior executives are less connected with on the ground reality. And right. You know, how do things actually work in our company? And I have certainly done presentations. I do a briefing, 5 things you need to know about business processes. And I've done that to C-level force. I said I've done that to C-level executives. I should have said I've done it for or with very senior executives. And I have, as I said in the last interview, I've had occasions where there's been face palming, especially if I give examples from within their own organization. So I think there's just a lack of awareness of how things really work in their own organizations, coupled with all this noise and distraction. Makes it hard for us lowly business process people to cut through the chaff.
Yes. So how do we go about that? Because I know there's quite a few people in the audience that are listening to this that they'll be fine. They would find themselves in this position right now where maybe they're in a position where they are doing process work, but they've recognized pretty soon after joining this organization that, okay, it's certainly not adopted enterprise-wide. It's certainly not high on the radar of our senior leaders. How do they go about continuing to promote this internally?
Well, I think I've said before that it's there's sometimes we get in our own way with the language we use. We talk about process too much, which isn't necessarily what everybody wants to hear about. And sometimes we can often go in either of 2 directions. Either go way up into this big picture stuff where we have this idea that we have to build out a complete process architecture and get our tooling in place and our standards before we can do anything. More commonly, though, the problem is like the 3 most common problems in the business process field or in process change that I find again and again. Number 3 on my list is a rapid descent into unhelpful detail. So I've many times I make the point that people hear the word process, but what registers in their mind is procedural level detail. How do I step by step complete a particular task? And, I remember somebody telling me once when they found out I was coming into their organization to do process work, they said, "Process? Please, no, we don't need more processes. We have thousands of processes and we don't need any more." And this really baffled me. This was earlier in my career. And when I made the mistake that I thought everybody knew what we meant by an end-to-end cross-functional business process. But it turns out the vast majority of people, when we talk about process, they think we're talking about putting handcuffs on them and dictating the minutia of how they do their day-to-day job, which is, that's not what process is about, getting all the moving parts working together. As Roger Tregear said in that great interview you did with him, you did a live session where people fired in questions, and we're talking about doing the same with me. But I remember Roger pointing out the truth that nothing significant comes out of an enterprise except through end-to-end processes. You simply, there is no real, what I call a real business process. They never exist within one functional area. So when people, and I like to, how do I demonstrate this? Well, I showed in the last interview we did my favorite diagram, the incredibly simple process versus function chart. And this is the one that gets senior executives, smacking their foreheads and realizing, I told the story last time of the president of basically the largest energy company in the United States. the president, smacking his forehead during a session I was running and basically realizing that things never improved because they were doing functional improvement, not process improvement. So we've got to have very simple language. I know you've had other people talking about, that all these incredibly detailed BPMN diagrams and complicated language and how that just repels people.
Yes. Yeah,
I try really hard to keep it simple. I try hard to tell stories. I try hard not to lecture. And, I was teaching in the Netherlands where I do actually the majority of my work has been in the Netherlands the last several years, especially the teaching. But I remember a guy, Joost Beckel, I think in one of my workshops, and he summed up my approach. He came up with an acronym, which is OOII, which stood for opportunistic, organic, interactive, and iterative. Because this was an advanced class and we were talking about not taking a boil the ocean approach, being an opportunist. You have a chance to apply your skills and techniques, even if it's not an entire end-to-end process. Just do it. Yes. Demonstrate value. Make sure you help people see and promote the value. You do this in an organic way. You do it iteratively. You don't try for the big bang, and you do it interactively. You're just, as I've discussed many times, for instance, just talking to people about, and learning to use their language. So I like that. Thanks, Joost. OOII. Opportunistic, organic, interactive, and iterative.
I love it.
It's worked for me.
And I found it interesting how you talked about people having this feeling of being handcuffed when talking about processes, because that resonated with me, because I've also heard that or got that sense, that feeling from people, different people that I talk to. It may not necessarily be them, but it might be the feeling from their organization. And they talk about wanting to be agile, wanting to adopt this agile approach, and we're doing an agile thing, not a process thing. And how does process and agile complement each other? How do they work together in a sustainable way? Because I think that's a gap in understanding from a lot of people out there.
I think it really is. And there's this perception that if you're doing business, well, like I said, business process work, all too often is perceived as sort of a top-down, top-heavy methodology driven approach. And what I prefer to do is, as I said in our first interview, I prefer to demonstrate as opposed to convince or sell. And I've had a lot of agile converts, people coming to my workshops for two reasons. One is agile used to be the new kid on the block, the bright and shiny thing that was going to save the day. But initially, it was applied on small initiatives, something that, you could get your arms around. Well, now it is assumed to be the default, and we are using agile or agile-like techniques on enterprise scale initiatives. And I have a few standard examples I go through to point out that you are not going to understand this global supply chain process based on a few user stories on colorful Post-its in your backlog. You really do need to know what are all the phases. One thing I like to demonstrate is how a little bit of data modeling or concept modeling saves time, because we don't have to refactor, or as I like to call it, rehactor forever. And when you've got, especially with people, the working from home since the pandemic, if you don't somehow help people see the big picture of all the moving pieces, not a detailed BPMN diagram, just like the simple examples I showed in the last interview, basically a block diagram. saying, okay, here are the 7 major phases in our launch product process. And for each of these phases, here are the 7 to 10 major tasks. I mean, that goes on one page. I've often finished that kind of a model in an hour and a half to 2 hours. And then we can start saying, okay, which of these, what are the minimum viable set of tasks that we can focus on that will get us through the entire process? Sorry, I'm probably drift. I had a fascinating consulting experience at one company that had a methodology that must have been created by a buzzword generator. It was Lean Sigma Agile. I thought, whoa, that's pretty much covering all the bases. And they were developing tooling for some major internal marketing processes based on the feature requests that they were getting. And stop me if I've told this story before, but their user community globally was always unhappy with what they were delivering. So they called in my colleague, Brianna, and I to have a look at the situation. And what we found very quickly was that they had no end-to-end process perspective. So yes, they were building high-quality software to implement a set of features that their community had said were desirable, but they never implemented enough to get all the way through the process.
Right.
And I can promise you there was a lot of face palming in the session where we helped people discover that. And it was just a few days, people in a room brainstorming activities and how do these activities fit together into a process and which ones are you actually supporting? And then people go, oh,
yes,
we're not actually helping people get all the way through the process. Am I even close to answering your question?
I think it's a great point to bring up, because I think, if you can show value, if you can demonstrate on an isolated case where the opportunities that we're missing, I think it is. I think it's obvious. If you're communicating using the right language according to the person sitting in front of you, it does make sense. And I think a lot of people would have those facepalm moments to be like, why haven't I thought about this before? This does make a lot of sense.
And they haven't, like, as you know from our last interview, my 2 favorite diagrams, like, even though like in my bio, it will mention I wrote a book like 20 years ago called Workflow Modeling. So long before there was BPMN or anything like that, I wrote the world's first book on how do we actually do this kind of modeling. Actually, the book was a complete methodology, but workflow modeling seemed like a good title from a marketing perspective. But even though I wrote that book, I was asked many years ago to participate in the development of what became BPMN. Unfortunately, I was too busy, or I would have pushed some. Well, I'll get on to that later. But the point is, even though I love my swim lane diagrams, but I don't do an as-is swim lane diagram on any more than 50% of my consulting jobs. I find these very simple block diagrams. I showed last time a sample of what I call a process scope model, which focuses on the pure what, the essence of the process. What is the trigger? What are the results? What are the 5 to 7 major phases? What are the cases or variations? And when people see that, and then I overlay that with here are all the functional organizations that are participating in this, and then I can ask, what are the chances that unless we look at the process, all of these pieces are going to mesh together? And when you put it to people that way, then, as you said, it really is obvious. People go, of course, that's like, getting the 500 chimpanzees to suddenly start typing Shakespeare. It's statistically possible, but not very probable.
Yes. Yeah. Great. No, that's good. I wanted to ask you about, there's obviously, we're in an era or a time where companies can just spring up very quickly, very rapidly, and disrupt entire industries and really change the direction of industries as well, and create a new normal. I think that there's so much technology available, and we've seen this happen from the early 2000s as far as I can remember, in terms of how much industries have been changed and disrupted. What are these organizations doing differently than say older large organizations that had dominating spaces for such a long time, but and maybe seemingly like, it feels like they're going to be around forever. Nothing can knock them from their perch. And then all of a sudden, we've got some serious competitors come onto the table.
Exactly. All of a sudden, some competitor comes along, which is much more nimble, and maybe through some change in regulation, they see an opening. I mentioned in our conversations before this interview that I've had some really difficult experiences in the last few years dealing with large global companies, in particular their procurement groups, because the procurement process, you get, well, I have joked often about what I call the axis of evil: purchasing, legal, and accounts payable. And now they are joined by the lesser minions, in legal, risk, security, compliance, and you've got all these groups all generating requirements and often very nonsensical and driven by bizarrely inappropriate processes. And some small company just doesn't even have the resources to put that many people. Like, I had a recent example where this has happened many times, where I am the chosen person to do a piece of consulting work or deliver some training, but the procurement process and the hurdles that they put in front of me make it uneconomic. So I've made some rules for the coming year about what I will do before I start charging for my time. But if you're in a startup, and then there's the democratization of technology, there may be, I mentioned there may be some regulatory barriers eliminated. And you mentioned early 2000s. Well, I was doing a lot of work in the United States then, and I remember a friend of mine working for a utility. I got to make sure I don't give the name of this away, but the power utility was in this particular state was a great big regulated enterprise with tens or maybe even hundreds of thousands of employees and the bureaucracy that goes with it. And then the state decided, well, we're going to allow interconnect, so other people are going to be able to, say, plug into the grid. And these smaller companies were very sensible or very successful because they didn't have the burden, the millstone of 30 years of functionally oriented, disintegrated technology. Mm-hmm. They could look at it, as I think I said last time, if you're wondering where to start, well, look at the process we were talking about this, to onboard a customer, right? Or onboard a supplier. And you in the utility example, a friend of mine was doing, at the time, very advanced object-oriented software development for this startup. And he was telling me what they were doing. And I said, that's amazing. And he said, yeah. And the really amazing thing is the big utility can't compete with us.
Right.
They just have too much entrenched policies and rules, too much entrenched process, too much entrenched software. I'm not sure if I've really answered your question or not, but
definitely.
I like hearing myself talk, I guess.
No, it is really interesting. I think we're going to see more and more of that happen, where organizations do find themselves in a tricky position where they aren't able to adapt and change. And I think a lot of it comes back to the mindset and the culture. And, we've only ever done it this way, and it can't be done another way. And if you don't have people that would even consider it being done another way, then it's, nothing will change,
Right. And somehow you have to opportunistically and organically get a small number of people to have a conversation. And then I think, I was talking earlier about the power of doing these very simple block diagrams of a process, not even getting into detailed flow models, but just something that says, I did this at one organization, a large East Coast university. I was brought in, ironically, to help them look at their procurement process. And by the way, I did not, during that session, refer to the axis of evil, purchasing, legal, and accounts payable. But we built a very good process scope model, just like in much less than the first hour of the session. Then we took it down to another level of detail for their main process to acquire a good or a service. And then we were able to attack that and figure out where are the main pain points and what will be the essence of a redesigned process. And we did that in 2 days. So it was, the sessions were like 9 a.m. till 2:30 p.m. I was busy cleaning stuff up in the evenings. But I'll remember the director of purchasing came to me afterwards and said, I have to admit that I thought this was going to be another one of those consultant-led. And then there was sort of an expletive that I won't share with your viewers, but he said he thought it was going to be just another waste of time because they had been trying to fix this process for years. And he said, this to me, this is nothing short of a miracle, what we accomplished in only 2 days.
Wow.
And that was, simple techniques, a lot of facilitation. I do know that I'm a strong facilitator, so I make sure everybody gets their say. We don't go around in circles. Everything gets captured. It's all visible. And if you do that, you have some simple techniques, then it's just astonishing how much you can get done in a short period of time.
Yeah, definitely. I know that one of the things that you that's part of your process adoption or process approach is ensuring that a concept model or a data model is required for a process change. Can you talk to the audience or talk to us a little bit about why?
Well, I think it's, the heart of the matter is, so a concept model, you can also call it a conceptual data model. One of my big clients calls it a business object model, but in its simplest form, it is a business friendly, depiction of the things about which we need information. So if I'm at a shipping company, I need to know about a customer. I need to know about a shipment. I need to know about a hub. I need to know about a route. And you discover that everybody, typically in a large organization, they all think they're talking the same language. But until we actually get down and start defining terms, like what do we actually mean by a customer or an employee or a shipment, it turns out we're not speaking the same language. And this, by the way, Daniel, has led to many facepalm moments. When I remember once doing this at a company, and the vice president of marketing leaned down the table and looked at the accounting director and said, "That's what you think a customer is? No wonder your reports are so useless." Anyway, now getting back to the point. So all these things in our model, a customer, a hub, a shipment, and so on, those are all the things that processes act on. So we have to onboard a customer. We have to deliver a shipment. We have to staff a hub. We have to, execute a route or something like that. And so understanding what the things are and how they fit together, how they are connected, is really fundamental to building a shared understanding of a process. So I could go on and on. I had a happy story, by the way, along these lines. A couple of years ago, a major financial institution in the United States had one of their executives came to the first day of one of my concept modeling classes. And I was giving an example of another major, like huge global financial enterprise that discovered that they did not know what a customer is. Customer could be anything from a credit card to an individual person to a corporation, which meant that a lot of their processes and their metrics were totally wrong. Anyway, this executive who attended my class, this was at a credit union, he turned and looked at one of the data people in the room who had organized me coming down there and said, well, hey, Steve, do we know what a member is? Do we know how many members we have? And the answer was not even close. So this executive went back and talked to his colleagues and said, we've got to do this. We're a data-driven enterprise, and we don't know what our data is, what it means. So I went and did 3 days of concept modeling with a senior leadership team that included, VPs and directors and a couple of C-level executives. And they found it really eye-opening how these very simple techniques could help them understand the core things that their processes act on and that their data and information is all about. Yeah.
It's amazing how, like when you share stories like this, I just find it amazing how these large organizations are still operating with such a lack of clarity or understanding.
I know it's shocking. As you know, when I look at processes in a company, when I'm assessing what is in place and helping to design what we're talking about doing, then I look in terms of the 6 enablers of a process: the design of the process, who does what when, the use of technology, motivation and measurement, human resources, roles, policies and rules, et cetera. And in private enterprise, the biggest problem I find with their business processes is poorly thought out performance measures.
Right.
And the performance measures are very functionally aligned, and they often get in the way of the entire process. But back to the concept model point, you can't get good measures, say, of customer retention or onboarding rate or churn or shrinkage if you don't know what these things are.
Yes. Yeah.
At the end of my 3 days at this financial institution, I always do a retrospective, where we, if I've spent 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 days with a group helping them through some challenge, I ask at the end, well, what worked? What worked? What didn't work? Just looking back, what are your thoughts? And at that financial organization, the comments were things like, we should have done this 20 years ago. But my favorite comment was from the chief strategy officer, who said, I cannot believe we actually solved the member definition problem. Because this is a credit union, which is defined essentially as a member-owned bank.
Yes.
They didn't really know. A simple example is a member different than the membership. If partners, two people are in some sort of a spousal or partnership arrangement, if one of them is a member, is the other one a member? That simple question can cut your number of members. It can double it or cut it in half.
Yes. Yeah, totally.
Anyway,
yeah.
I get excited about this topic. We could do a whole session sometime on just the value of concept modeling in the process world.
Yeah, I think it'll be good when we do the live session. I'm sure we're going to have a ton of people that will want to come in. I think our biggest challenge we'll try and harness all the questions and keep the discussion focused. But
no, your biggest challenge will be putting a dial on me so I don't rattle on and on. That's the challenge.
So one I guess other problem that comes up from time to time in the conversations that I have is around process modeling being this idea that process modeling being a bit of a waste of time instead of sort of adding value and even saving time. I guess it comes back to maybe that conversation we were having earlier about this agile way of thinking. Oh, we're not going to map all our processes out. But talk to us about how process modeling, when done well, can actually be a time saver.
Oh, yeah. It's I was just looking at a quote that I have on my little board at the side here of quotes. One of my colleagues in the UK, just enough, just in time. And I think that's people get put off process modeling because they, like, a lot of the tooling is whether it's data modeling or process modeling, a lot of the tooling was created or designed for implementation level or execution level purposes. And it serves us well to remember that a process model can be 5 boxes in a row, like a medical process, we can reduce it down to, intake, assessment, diagnosis, treatment, follow-up, like very high level. So there's this confusion that process modeling has to be very detailed. It has to be a flow model. And then people often pull that down to a very, as I've said, a procedural level of detail. Mm-hmm. So if I can, I'll just, 2 examples. People got put off data modeling, I think, for many years because the early data modeling tools were not actually supportive of data modeling. They were actually relational database design tools. That immediately took us down to questions of primary keys and referential integrity and so on, and 5th normal form. Well, no, concept modeling is much simpler than that. And all we need is boxes, lines, and maybe eventually a couple of additional symbols. Same with process modeling. The people, I got beat up about a year ago. I was teaching a workshop and online, and somebody was really taking issue with me for creating this whole new diagramming standard, when we've got BPMN available to us. And I said, my standard is boxes and lines. That's it. That's not a standard. That's just a way to communicate with people on a very simple and intuitive basis. And, like BPMN originally was not designed for working with business people. It was a platform independent means of describing automated workflow and all the required logic. And people take a BPMN tool and then try and use too many of those available widgets when they are working with business people. And all of my most successful process redesign initiatives have been done with nothing any more challenging than Post-its and flip chart paper, and a very clear framework and strong facilitation. The tooling, absolutely, we need the tooling, we need the repository, and so on later, but we don't need to start there.
Yes,
we need to communicate with business people in a way that is intuitive and not intimidating.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Alec, obviously, it's obvious that your passion for this topic is you've got so much passion. It's contagious. I'm getting excited. I know the audience will be getting excited as well. And I want to, I guess, remind the audience again, we're going to be teeing up a live session with Alec over the coming months. We'll obviously give plenty of notice and warning before that happens, possibly sometime in March or April, but we'll see how the year tracks. We'll give you an opportunity to ask your questions of Alec. I'm sure that's going to be a long episode, an extended episode, because there'll be plenty of questions to get through. But Alec, I just want to thank you for sitting down with us again, because it's been so great to dive into these particular topics. I've certainly been gleaning a lot, and I can already think of at least half a dozen people I need to send this episode to already. So I just want to thank you for sitting down with me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I'm feeling pretty excited about it as well. And let's just remind your viewers, go back and look at that first interview we did together, because I showed a few PowerPoint slides in there, samples of these very simple models that are really provide some aha moments for business folks.
Fantastic. That's great. And if you have been listening to this series for a while, or you've just tuned in, if you've got some value out of it, it would mean a lot if you could give us a rating or a review. These episodes are getting very popular, getting quite popular, and we'd love to continue to spread the process excellence, process transformation message throughout the world, because I know it's helping a lot of people. I get a lot of feedback. I get a lot of people that thank me for putting on this series, and really I just sit in the seat that asks the questions to the experts, to the specialists, and I'm gleaning just as much as you all are. So it would mean a lot if you could go and give us a rating, give us a review, subscribe to our channel. It's just going to help continue to propel this series forward.
Okay, thanks. I'll look forward to our live Q&A session.